In a universe where criminals treat etiquette like scripture and paranoia like cardio, few moments are more revealing than a veteran boss feigning ignorance of a long-serving New Jersey captain who has spent decades announcing himself with the subtlety of a marching band. The exchange is often treated as a simple gag, one more pin stuck into an ego that never learned the difference between rank and relevance. It plays better as a study in power, the kind that does not need to raise its voice because it can erase someone with a single, politely baffled question. The central claim is straightforward. The boss knew exactly who the captain was and chose to ignore him on purpose. The supporting logic is not mystical, it is structural. This is not a world in which senior leadership can afford to be ignorant of the people who carry status in neighboring crews, especially neighboring crews with whom they routinely share revenue, disputes, and the ceremonial choreography of dinners, funerals, weddings, and sit-downs. The milieu is insulated yet intensely social. Reputations circulate faster than money, and names are currency. A made man is not a rumor. He is an entry on a ledger. When the books open, when buttons are issued, when commissions or commission-adjacent relationships are maintained, names travel. A captain under a family that does business with New York for years is not an obscure footnote. The argument is even stronger given the specific shape of the relationship between the families. The New York side is not merely aware of New Jersey, it profits from it, manages it, patronizes it, and occasionally considers violence over it. That posture requires familiarity with personnel, not because everyone is admired, but because everyone is a variable. The idea that a long-tenured captain could drift in and out of this ecosystem for decades without being known strains credulity in a setting where men keep mental spreadsheets of who has a button, who is close to whom, and who is useful. This is why the "he genuinely did not know" defense sounds less like realism and more like wishful literalism. It is certainly true that New York is large and New Jersey is smaller, and bosses do not make it a hobby to memorize every soldier in every satellite organization. A real-world analog is often cited. One of the actual 5 families has been estimated at roughly 250 to 300 made members. And even if the fictional family is not a one-to-one mapping, scale matters. At that scale, a boss will prioritize the people who generate meaningful revenue, the people who sit across tables in high-stakes negotiations, and the people who can disrupt stability. He will not, as a matter of personal enrichment, wander around shaking every hand or collecting every name. That is the strongest version of the counterargument. The captain was not important enough, not lucrative enough, and not central enough to be memorable. But the counterargument quietly concedes the point that makes the snub interpretation so compelling. If the boss's memory is selective and transactional, then forgetting can be performance rather than failure. The boss remembers who matters to him and forgets who does not. Recognition is dispensed like currency. If the captain does not generate meaningful income for New York, why spend recognition on him, especially in public? That question is not rhetorical. It is the entire mechanism of the scene. The boss's personality further strengthens this reading. He is repeatedly depicted as careful, laconic, and structurally allergic to unnecessary disclosure. Half the time he lets his deputy do the talking. The other half, he speaks in a way that closes doors rather than opening them. He is the kind of leader who will listen, nod, and offer the sterile compliment that ends a conversation without granting intimacy. That caution is not affectation. It is how power avoids exposure. Put that temperament at a public wedding and introduce a loud, eager, status-hungry captain approaching without a buffer, and the result is predictable. The problem is not simply the approach. In that world, protocol exists for a reason. A soldier, and even a captain, does not stroll up to a boss and introduce himself like a stranger at a cocktail reception. Introductions across ranks are mediated by someone who knows both parties and can control the framing. Bypassing that gatekeeper is not bold, it is presumptuous. It forces the boss to either engage and risk association, or disengage and risk offense, and seasoned bosses tend to prefer the risk that keeps them safest. The captain then compounds the error with the kind of timing that makes leadership view him not as an ally, but as a liability with legs. After the initial respectful engagement, the captain drifts toward business, mentions names, and tries to sound connected. At a wedding, in public. The moment the conversation pivots toward all this business with a boss by name, the situation stops being social and becomes evidentiary. A careful leader does not need certainty that a wire exists. He needs only the possibility. The boss's cutoff functions like the strong, silent version of wiping one's hands on an overeager subordinate, a decisive refusal to let the wrong conversation bloom in the wrong room. The "who talked to me about what" style reply is simultaneously safety and insult. Safe because it keeps the content from forming a prosecutable narrative, insulting because it denies the captain the social validation he came to collect. Even if the captain were not wired, he behaves as though he might be, and in this environment, that is enough to trigger dismissal. There is also the contempt layer, which the narrative reinforces repeatedly. New Jersey is treated as beneath New York's notice, a glorified crew in the vocabulary that trickles down to men who use it as cover for disrespect. A captain from New Jersey walking up at a household employee's family wedding and acting like a peer is not merely annoying, it is audacious. The boss has every hierarchical incentive to remind him of his place, and the cleanest way to do that is to deny him familiarity altogether. If the captain had approached, paid respects, and withdrawn, the boss could have offered a minimal courtesy and moved on. Instead, the captain performs camaraderie, punctuates with forced cheer, and tries to import business into a public setting. The boss's response becomes a form of posturing, the smallest possible sentence that produces the largest possible demotion. The snub also aligns with another plausible factor. The captain is precisely the kind of person a politically ambitious deputy can exploit. He is petty, talkative, and eager to believe that more important people are paying attention. Feed that appetite with flattery and future promises, and information will flow. The captain becomes a pipeline. The deputy can pump him for details about New Jersey, use those details to press for money or leverage, and keep the captain loyal by hinting at status upgrades that never arrive. It is entirely plausible that the boss is aware that the captain has been used this way, and if so, acknowledging him publicly is not merely unnecessary, it is reputationally risky. No leader wants to be seen greeting a known leak as though he is a trusted colleague, especially not in a setting designed for optics. In that framework, the boss's question is not ignorance, it is quarantine. It is also an elegant humiliation. The captain's identity is built on being somebody, on the belief that longevity and a button guarantee recognition. Watching him discover, in real time, that power does not automatically confer celebrity is one of the series' sharper moments. It is a bubble-bursting scene. A man's self-importance collapses under the weight of another man's indifference. The humiliation is not cosmetic. It has consequences. The injury to pride festers. It is not an accident that this scene becomes part of a chain that ends with an elderly woman's death. Because in this world, bruised egos do not simply sulk. They seek compensation, and compensation often comes from the nearest defenseless target. That is the show's moral economy. The powerful dispense slights, the insecure absorb them, and the innocent pay the bill. If the wedding exchange exposes one man's delusions, it also exposes another myth: the boss's reputation as an unassailable paragon of old-school leadership. There is a persistent tendency to treat him as the show's last true professional, the elder statesman who keeps everything about business, while younger men spiral into emotional melodrama. The record is messier. He makes moves that are not merely firm but counterproductive, immature, and strategically corrosive. A key example is the prolonged dispute over a percentage in a major housing and development arrangement, where his stubborn refusal to compromise pushes the situation to the brink of violence and internal betrayal. He comes close to being killed not because of some noble refusal to bend, but because his posture turns into an irritant so costly that his own deputy considers removing him. Holding out on an aggressive number until the final minute is not automatically tough. Sometimes it is simply poor business judgment. It bleeds money, destabilizes relationships, and invites ambitious subordinates to test whether the boss is still useful. The boss's relationship management is equally questionable. He sometimes appears to value doing business with New Jersey, yet he simultaneously nurtures a culture of disrespect toward them, encouraging subordinates to underestimate and belittle a partner he continues to profit from. That is an impressive way to sabotage cooperation while pretending to pursue mutual benefit. If the goal is stability, teaching your men to treat your business partners like inferiors is not strategy. It is vanity wearing a suit. Succession is where the myth of competence becomes hardest to defend. The boss has a son whose limitations are obvious, yet he grants him influence without adequate discipline and fails to establish a clean transition path. The result is predictable. Once the boss dies, the organization becomes a stage for a civil war between those who want to pretend the son is fit and those who want to seize power. Leaving a leadership vacuum is not an accident. It is negligence or cynical self-interest. His handling of his deputy during the infamous spouse insult crisis is similarly revealing. The boss is correct about the practical stakes. Letting a deputy launch a vendetta over wounded pride is terrible for business. Yet he communicates this truth in a way that disrespects the deputy's intelligence, treating the outrage as though it were a literal misunderstanding, rather than the performative, status-protecting anger it plainly is. The deputy does not actually believe anyone is proposing to exploit his spouse. He is insisting on consequences to preserve face. The boss's dismissive tone creates durable resentment, and that resentment later becomes part of the organizational fracture. In short, the boss survives, yes. He avoids prison, and he dies naturally, which in that world is practically a retirement plan. But survival is not synonymous with excellence. It is sometimes the reward for caution, discretion, and letting others absorb risk. Caution is a tactic, not a full governance model. The more sophisticated defense of the boss, however, turns those alleged mistakes into a coherent strategy. The stubbornness in the percentage dispute was not about money at all. It was about forcing a rival family boss into a corner, where the only viable non-violent option was to go through the boss's son, thereby conferring legitimacy on an otherwise unimpressive heir. Under this reading, the boss takes an unacceptable position deliberately, so the rival cannot accept it. He ignores his deputy's attempts at compromise deliberately, so the stalemate persists. He permits escalation because he calculates there is time before the point of no return. And he leaves the rival with two realistic choices: escalate into war or seek a solution through the son. When the rival travels to meet the son gains status simply through being treated as a gatekeeper. The boss then settles at the rival's final number, far below the initial demand, because the goal was never the percentage, it was the narrative. He undercuts his deputy while elevating his son, and he instructs everyone to remember the son's contribution. That is shrewd in the way only criminals can be shrewd. It uses institutional conflict as a prop to manufacture legitimacy. There is a second related defense. Refusing to name a successor is deliberate statecraft. If a leader openly anoints an heir, he diminishes his own power instantly. Everyone begins dealing with the heir, and the sitting boss becomes a ceremonial figure, a boss in name only, like a man waiting for the check while others order dessert. By keeping succession ambiguous, the boss preserves leverage until the end. The cost is instability after death, but the logic is consistent. What happens after death is not a problem for the living ego. These competing readings are not mutually exclusive. A leader can be both strategically cunning and institutionally reckless, both capable of manipulating a single dispute and negligent about the damage those manipulations create. In a world where the long game requires restraint, humility, and structure, the long game is often just a series of short games stacked awkwardly on top of each other. The wedding snub fits that pattern. It is tactically perfect, socially brutal, and institutionally meaningless, except as a reminder that recognition is a privilege granted by power, not a right earned by tenure. The same pattern governs the series' broader gallery of catastrophic timing, those moments when characters choose the worst possible sentence at the worst possible second, as though consequence were an abstract concept. The crown jewel remains the infamous "whatever happened there" line, a verbal match tossed into a room already filled with fumes. But it is not alone. There is the chemotherapy joke delivered in the shadow of real grief, the sort of bravado that assumes protection exists, even when it plainly does not. There is the desperate plea that our kids go to the same school, a sentence that mistakes social proximity for safety and assumes violence cares about community ties. There are the rationalizations for cruelty, the insistence that tragedy is merely clumsiness, and the tortured defenses offered for other despicable acts, as though language can launder reality. There is the blunt reminder that someone is in the mafia, spoken when the listener is already exhausted, and the admission about never passing a drug test, offered like charming candor in a world where candor gets people killed. The bleakest of these is the earnest civilian invoking "live for today" while trying to reason with a drunken, homicidal sociopath. In ordinary life, it is harmless counsel. In this world, it is a fatal misunderstanding, a motivational slogan used as a shield against someone who does not recognize shields. Another seize-the-day contender is the provocateur who walks into a butcher shop and chooses mockery as his final hobby, needling two volatile men with the confidence of someone who treats consequences as a rumor. In a perverse way, it is admirable. Commitment to banter so absolute it survives even when surrounded by men who do not interpret jokes as jokes. That admiration ends quickly, because some people do not tempt fate. They feed it and complain about the portion size. Even domestic scenes deliver their own discomfort. A father introduces his male heir with rehearsed gravitas and turns paternal pride into public unease. The heir is widely disliked later, yet the disdain conveniently ignores the earlier events that shaped him, because complexity is inconvenient and scapegoats are efficient. A sarcastic question about vegetarianism aimed at a man who consumes meat in heroic quantities becomes a miniature portrait of hypocrisy. A preference for some pulp becomes a power struggle disguised as a grocery choice. The series even allows rare moments where the usual bully is forced to absorb embarrassment. A tasteless song parody and a crude medical boast land badly enough that retaliation runs in reverse. The pattern is consistent. People speak as though the recipient is not already at the end of his patience. And sometimes these disasters are not accidents. Certain characters weaponize ambiguity with the artistry of an arsonist, dropping an unfortunate remark and letting others set themselves on fire while maintaining plausible innocence. The suggestion that the most infamous line was deliberate fits that pattern. In a world where everyone is always working an angle, stupidity and strategy often wear the same expression, and arguments about intent become a secondary sport that distracts from the primary reality. Words are weapons, and timing is the blade. The refusal to recognize the captain gains plausibility when remembering how often leadership treats identity as transactional. The boss remembers the names that put money in his pocket and conveniently forgets the ones that do not. He knows the construction point man because that man touches shared projects and shared money. A captain whose chief talent is gossip and grievance simply does not rate consistent attention. That transactional selectivity is why the "he was old" explanation rarely satisfies. Age may dull patience, but it does not erase a profit map. Even a brief exchange glance in a sit-down suggests recognition already. The boss recognizes high-impact figures when money is involved, and he tracks disputes closely enough to contemplate violence over a single associate. He is shown reading people, not merely forgetting them. He has been in the same rooms as this captain at large gatherings, including celebrations after new members are made, and leadership on both sides participates in book openings and commission-style coordination. A boss may not memorize every soldier, but a decades-long captain is not an anonymous intern. If the question is asked anyway, it functions less like confusion and more like control. The smallest sentence that produces the largest demotion. The captain's history of self-sabotage strengthens the intentional brush-off reading. This is the same personality type that presses for meetings at the moment his boss is already furious about some petty irritation. The same instinct that cannot resist talking when silence would be profitable. And the same loose tongue that turns private family business into public conversation. When such a man approaches at a wedding and leads with forced familiarity, he is not offering respect. He is advertising risk. Disastrous timing is a franchise-wide hobby. A waiter approaches two volatile men in a parking lot with concern about service and learns, too late, that etiquette has limits. A father introduces his male heir with rehearsed gravitas and makes pride sound like a sentence. A domestic debate about orange juice becomes a proxy war for control. A song parody and a crude medical boast land badly enough that even the usual aggressor is forced to swallow embarrassment. The pattern is consistent. People speak as though the recipient is not already at the end of his patience. Seen through that lens, the wedding question is governance delivered as manners. Downgrade the interaction, refuse familiarity, and force the other man to feel the hierarchy. If the captain had paid respects and left without trying to trade on intimacy or drag business into a public event, the boss could have been politely appropriate. Instead, the captain performed importance he had not earned, and the boss responded with the only safe correction: subscribe.